You probably have a better chance of being struck by lightning or winning the lottery than to actually show that voter fraud really affected the outcome of an election. And by that, imagine a decimal where you have 0.000 and like a 6 or a 7. That's the incidence of voter fraud in the United States. Voter fraud is incredibly, incredibly small. When we actually look at the documented proof regarding how much voter fraud occurs in the United States, it's insignificantly small.
When they talk about turnout, they're using numbers that haven't been really researched. And they often point to Indiana, saying that voter turnout increased after the photo ID requirement was put into place. But what they fail to mention is that there was actually a steady increase before then, and that it just was remaining steady from one presidential year to another presidential year.
What we have here is a fascinating argument being made by proponents, supporters of photo ID. When they're confronted with the fact that says that there's very little voter fraud out there. For example, the main case in Indiana that went to the U.S. Supreme Court, the state of Indiana, when they adopted their photo ID law, said, we have not a single documented case of voter fraud in the entire history of the state of Indiana. Zilch, nada. And this one, what people who support photo ID come back and say is, aha, look at how good the fraud is. The fraud is so good, it's undetectable, that without photo ID, we don't know how much fraud there really is.
And when you talk about election integrity, there's 2 points. The integrity of election includes as many voters as possible, eligible voters as possible. And excluding eligible voters means that there might be an election integrity issue where the people that are elected into office really don't represent all eligible voters. It would only mean all eligible voters who happen to have the proper ID.
There'll be costs associated with getting the ID.
People with disabilities tend not to have a driver's license, though they can vote, and they tend not to have a need for a photo ID. And I think one of the most compelling cases is women who live at a battered women's shelter.
Two populations that might be hurt by a photo ID law might be students and it might be the elderly.
Well, I really think there's no doubt that this bill would discourage youth turnout. I say discourage because it does erect further burdens of proof of ID, having the proper identification, having an up-to-date identification, and being able to present this on election day, both if you want to register at the polls or simply to cast a ballot.
Anytime you have a very mobile population, it's going to be harder to fix them at a certain spot at a certain time, and you're supposed to vote where you live on election day.
What do you even consider your primary residence at that point? Is it your parents' house? Is it where you move this year, where you're gonna, because you're probably gonna be living somewhere else next year when you go back to school. So you move it back and forth 2 or 3 times a year.
So no matter what you're gonna do, you're gonna drive down voter turnout for young people, and I just think that's a big mistake.
A group of people that would be disenfranchised, unquestionably, based on some of the legislation that is being proposed, and that is the 11 tribes that are here in Minnesota. They have tribal IDs. They're their own sovereign nation, and Minnesota cannot dictate what is on their tribal IDs. So the first problem that we have here compared to other states is that they are ensured the right to vote or to use their ID to vote. The legislation or some of the legislation prevents them from retaining that right.
To me, it's about rigging the ballot. It's basically saying that they're going to try to get the electorate that they want by setting up restrictive voting ID laws to prevent people they don't like from voting against them.
I believe it was 1898 in North Carolina. There was fear of voter fraud. And they changed the Constitution. And what they did is they decided to add a poll tax and to have a literacy test. And some people could say the intention behind that wasn't the fear of election fraud, but that they wanted to disenfranchise people. So that's what was the intent, I don't know. But the impact was, before 1898, 98% of African American men voted in North Carolina. 98%. And after that passed, less than 10% of them voted. So I think that a lot of people get stuck on intent, but it's about the outcomes, the impact, that I think is much more important.
But there is an incredible myth being pushed in the United States, pushed that, in fact, voter fraud is widespread, it's rampant, and that's affecting the outcome of elections. And that is what these photo ID laws are trying to address, is this impression, this belief. And this belief is oftentimes brought up, and I hate to say this, by one political party, which is claiming that the only reason why, for example, Al Franken won was because of voter fraud, or the only reason why somebody like Dayton won was voter fraud. And so it's oftentimes raised by Republicans who want to claim to say that, well, the reason why we've lost close elections is because these illegal people voted. Somehow felons voted, ineligible students voted, people were impersonating one another. And somehow, if we could tighten up the law, if we had proof in fact of who people are, we wouldn't have all this fraud occurring. Well, the fact of the matter is, A, the fraud isn't there, and B, many of these laws won't detect or won't address the fraud that they're claiming occurs anyhow.
I think that voting should not be something that you take lightly. I think that people really celebrate the fact that so many people vote here in Minnesota, that we do not have unnecessary barriers here to vote, but I do feel like these are unnecessary barriers that would be created.
The bills are changing substantially almost every time there's a new hearing. There are major changes. Now, I don't think Governor Dayton's ever going to sign a photo ID bill, but if he did, I guess some of these things might be corrected before he would sign the bill. I think the big question is what's going to turn up to be on the constitutional amendment ballot in 2012.